Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some cards using the new Propagation Garden collection from Spellbinders. They sent me these to create with and share with you, and I'm so excited about the different variety in this collection. There is several different die sets, an embossing folder, a better press plate and die set, as well as a stamp and die set. I've already used this laboratory glassware die set to create a chemistry themed card and then a vintage light card. So those have already been posted by the time this one is going to be posted. For these cards in this video, I'm going to create 3 different cards, and they're going to be a little bit more or using the rest of the Propagation Garden collection. I am using that laboratory glassware again, but I'm also going to use some other goodies, and they all coordinate really, really well together. You can use several, you could use all of them. I am going to first play around with this Better Press plate and die set. I'm going to use it in the Better Press system, and I'm going to watercolor the images with my Caron markers. Now, full disclosure, while I love looking at plants, I do not do well with keeping them alive, so I don't have very many. I also have no idea what their names are. So because of that, not able to look them up to see what color they're actually supposed to be. So if I color something wrong, it's just because I like those colors. I also really love the plants or the leaves that have the pink in them. So several of my cards, I'm going to be adding a little bit of pink to the center of the leaves because I like that look. It may not be real to life. I don't know. You're welcome to put it in the comments. I'm comfortable with it. If it is not real to life, I like the way they turned out. So with that disclosure in place, let's start using that Better Press set. So I'm using 3 of the leaves, and I end up only using 1 of the leaves in my final card. At this point, I liked these shapes and I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do with them, but I wanted to use them and I wanted to watercolor with them. So the ones that I haven't used in this video, I'll use them in a future card. I arranged them on my plate so that I could move them over and get 2 printings of each leaf on the same piece of cardstock. And it was really easy to do. I just paid attention to which one was over that center line and which one was back farther, and then did the opposite on the opposite side. Now, I just realized I didn't mention what the name of this one was. It's called Tropical Leaves, and I'm doing this on Spellbinders watercolor paper. So I'm going to do direct to paper with my markers, and then I'm going to use my water brush to watercolor it in. I'm doing 1 leaf at a time. You could probably do a couple. I didn't want to give that ink time to dry on the watercolor paper before I went and did my watercoloring. I wanted to make sure that ink was still nice and fresh and hadn't soaked into the paper yet, which is why I'm doing it this way. So I have my set of Caron markers. I picked out a few different ones to use. So the first 4 that I have here are 228 Lush Green and 253 Grass. When I go and add the pink to it, I'm using 359 Magenta and 375 Cerise. And then the last leaves that I'm doing, I'm adding a little bit of yellow to the outside of them. And that is 166 Canary and 216 Almond. So I use a water brush here that has water in the handle, and between leaves I am cleaning the tip of my brush off on a piece of paper towel. I just like that I don't have any ink residue left, so when I go to watercolor the next leaf, I don't have any more ink on there to introduce to it. And I can make sure just to blend the 2 inks that are on there. The other thing I like about this watercolor brush is if I have to clean it off to go to a completely different color, I just squeeze that handle. It flushes water through the brush fibers, and then I wipe it off on that same paper towel, and I have a completely clean brush. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I happen to have a jar of water on my desk, I would likely spill it. And I have a video somewhere here from probably about 1.5 years or 2 years ago where I did actually spill a jar of water with my project. So this is the greatest thing ever to me, this brush, because I don't have to worry about an open jar of water sitting on my desk. I don't have to worry about tipping anything over. The only thing that I have to worry about is making sure that I have enough water in that handle. And typically I will fill it up under the tap before I start a project, and it's good to go for the rest of the project. Most of the time I don't have to refill it in the middle of the project, but it's easy enough to do if needed. This is my favorite brush for watercoloring, so much so that when one of my daughters borrowed it years ago to do some watercoloring because she wanted to try it, I got worried about not getting it back. She was a teen, that was a possibility. So I bought myself a backup one so I didn't have to worry about it. And so now I luckily have two because I did get that brush back. But I absolutely love this brush, and I use it all the time when I want to do some watercoloring. And it doesn't matter what color or what watercolor medium you use with it. I've used it with my Distress watercolor pencils. I've used it with these Caron markers or even other dye-based markers for doing watercoloring. And I also have used it regularly with my Distress refills to do watercoloring with that. Anything that you can do watercoloring with, you can work with this brush. Also, Perfect Pearls, using that for watercolors works beautifully. Now I'm using the Caron markers here. These are dye-based markers. Any dye-based marker would work. You could also use a different method of watercoloring if that's what you wanted. If you wanted to use ink pad re-inkers that are dye-based, that would work as well. If you didn't have the re-inkers, you could take a dye-based ink pad and smush it onto either a piece of plastic, or I'm working on the Tim Holtz surface media mat here. You could smush it on there and then pick up the ink from there. If you wanted your ink colors to not be quite as vibrant as this, you could also take your Caron markers, just scribble them onto a piece of plastic or the Tim Holtz media mat, and then lift up the colors from there. And I did a video fairly recently where I did just that. It's an easy way to use the dye-based markers, but you get just a little bit lighter color because you're mixing water with that ink before you're applying it to the paper. When I do it the way that I'm doing it here, my colors are going to be a lot more vibrant because of the fact that I'm putting that ink color right to the paper, and then I'm taking the ink brush to blend the colors. I'm not removing any. I'm not really adding a whole lot of water other than just enough to blend that out. So for this particular leaf here, I used both greens, the dark, the light, and then I used the pink. For the leaf set before, I think I just used the light one and then one of the pinks. This one here, I'm doing the same as the last one where I'd used the dark green, the light green, but I swapped out the pinks just to see if there was much color difference with them. And there's a little bit, it's a little bit lighter, but not a huge difference. Like you can see there's a little bit of difference between the color tone once I blend them together. This pink is a little bit lighter, so it's a little bit more subtle. But because plants, even within the same plant, you can get different color tones, I wanted to have a bit of variety. And like I said before, at this point, I wasn't sure which ones I was going to use to create my final card. So I wanted to make sure that they were going to somewhat coordinate with each other, depending on which ones that I use. But I did want there to be some variation in the leaves. With this one, the last one here is where I add some of those yellows. So the first one here, I'm adding the almond on the outside of the leaf. And when I go to blend that in, I'm going to be blending the green into that. So it's going to basically just lighten up my green. I'm not going to see a ton of that yellow color. And it's a really pale yellow. I wanted to try the subtle one first before going with the brighter one, just to see if I liked that final look. So I used that almond color, I used the two different greens and the lighter of the two pinks here just to do it in the center of that leaf. And once again, you could leave that pink out if that's not your cup of tea. You could absolutely leave that out and just do the greens with maybe a little bit of the almond color at the end, just to give a little bit more color tone. And with all of these, I'm just putting that ink down on the paper and then using my water brush to blend it out. Now, obviously, this particular leaf is a lot bigger than the small leaves on the first two branches that I did. So I am working fairly quickly. I still want that ink to be somewhat damp and not really soaked into that cardstock. So I'm working quickly, but I'm trying to pay attention to the open areas on the leaf and not accidentally fill those pieces in. And I'm also trying not to go out of the lines, but sometimes, and you wouldn't even notice it on the video, sometimes when you're doing something really, really quick, you miss some of those details. So after this entire thing is filled in, I can blend those two together. And because I'm working while that ink is still somewhat damp, I don't have to worry as much about making sure I go over the entire leaf. If I waited for that to completely dry and then I used my water brush and rehydrated that ink and blended it out, first of all, it would be a little bit harder to blend that ink out because I would also have to rehydrate it, but I would also have to make sure I go over the entire leaf or else I would get some watermarks. Once my leaves are done and they have dried for a few minutes, I'm taking the coordinating dies for them and I'm using some yellow tape to tape them in place, make sure that they don't shift on me at all while I put them through the die cutting machine. I'm going to be die cutting in 2 different batches here. The only thing that you need to make sure of is that your dies do not overlap each other. If they overlap each other, you're going to ruin your die. And we definitely don't want to be doing that. So you can die cut multiple pieces on that same piece of cardstock as long as those dies don't overlap each other. They can go near each other, that's totally fine. Just make sure they're not overlapping. Once you have them in place, we can put them through the die cutting machine. Now, I typically like die cutting with the blade side up on my dies. I learned many, many years ago that when you do it with the blade side down a lot, your dies start to curve. So I typically prefer with the die side up. However, I found that when die cutting stamp shapes or better press shapes, that if I have my die blade faced up, that I tend to have that paper ride on that die and shift a little bit. So by having the blade side down for things like this, you get a little bit more of a precise cut. So I'm going to use the coordinating embossing folder with this collection, and it's called the Leafy Helix embossing folder. It's a 2D embossing folder, so I'm using the stacking in my Spellbinders Platinum 6 for 2D embossing folders. I played around a little bit with the leaves and I decided to just use this one here. And originally I had planned to ink blend that embossing folder, but I just really liked that plain texture on the white. You absolutely could ink blend it if you wanted to add some color to that, but I wanted those leaves to pop off. Now, when I first pulled out my sentiment from the coordinating sentiment and die set for this collection, I thought it would be great to use the Caron markers to color that stamp and then stamp it. And it did work well. I could get several different colors, but it wasn't a really precise stamping. Like, it was a little bit, because the markers are fairly wet, it just wasn't a precise stamping. So I ended up scrapping that idea, grabbing a distress ink pad. This one is the Maude Lawn one because it was the nice bright green to coordinate with those leaves, and then just stamped that. And I was much happier with that stamping. If you happen to have dye-based markers that are a little bit drier than these Caron markers, using them to color your stamp to coordinate or to use multiple colors works absolutely perfect. But I probably could have waited for them to dry slightly before stamping, but I tried it a few different times and I just wasn't happy with the result and ended up doing this, and it was a much better stamping and it looked a lot better with that, with those leaves. So now that I have all of my pieces together, I can glue them to the top of the card. So I have a light green mat here. I also have a pink one to make that pop of pink, or that to coordinate with the pop of pink in those leaves. And I'm just using a smaller mat with that pink there. Look at that gorgeous texture from that embossing folder. And you could really use either side. It's your choice. I chose to do it this way where the details were popping out, but I think it would look great the other way as well. You could also take that embossing folder and ink it before embossing it and get some more color that way. Like I said, I really liked the texture with the plain white cardstock. I will use this embossing folder again for one of the cards in this video, and for that one I will do a little bit of inking on it. I'm using some Barely Art glue to glue this card together, and I have it in a fine tip bottle so I can get just the right amount of glue. I like to use a large acrylic block to hold everything down. and make sure everything is flat and has good contact with the paper below it. I'll leave that on there for a few minutes. This glue starts to grab really quite quickly. So within a minute or so, it starts to grab that cardstock. So you don't need to put that acrylic block on there till it's completely dry. Here is the final card. I absolutely love those leaves. Another option for those leaves before die cutting them, I think it would be gorgeous misted with a shimmer mist or perfect pearls mist, just to add a bit of a different texture. For the next card, I'm pulling out the Propagation Frames die set, and this one is intended to create 2 different frames to put the laboratory glassware, just like the propagation stands that you can get in real life. But for this second card here, I'm actually only using the pieces from that die set that are straight board. I'm going to cut them out of a gray beige cardstock and create a barnwood-like background. Before I do that, I'm pulling out the laboratory glassware that I want to use on this card. I really like the one with that round bottom, but I don't think it's big enough to do what I want for this card. But I'm going to make these glassware anyways because I'm going to use whatever is left over on the second card. So it's not going to go to waste. And I'm doing something for these that I want to give time to dry. I have both of these here. I'm going to cut 3 of each out of this clear Duralar from Ranger. It is a clear plastic, perfect for alcohol inks, but it die cuts beautifully. So I can easily die cut these pieces. I thought these glassware would look really nice done out of a clear material, so they were completely see-through, similar to actual glassware. Now you could color these with Copic markers, but you're going to need a marker that is darker than the color you think you're going to need. And really the easier way to color these would be alcohol ink. So I'm going to use an alcohol ink here. This one is just aqua. You can use whatever color works for you, but because you can get a lot more ink on here, you can actually see the color. You could even use a lighter one if this is a little bit too dark for your taste. You can also dilute it with some isopropyl alcohol if you wanted the color even lighter. I wanted to at least be able to see the color on my background. So this is the color that I chose. You don't even need to have color. If you wanted to just do the next step without any color on it, you could absolutely do that. But I thought by adding a touch of color, it just made it more apparent that it was supposed to look like water. Now I have a lot of alcohol ink on that scrap piece of paper there. So I'm going to put it on a new piece of paper, and then I end up using my mat from my glass media mat, and I'm going to actually work on that instead. These pieces of Duralar are already dry with that alcohol ink, but I want to add some glossy accents to them. That's going to add some more dimension and some more shine, and it's going to give that water level a little bit more, it's going to be a little bit more prominent. So I have a bottle of glossy accents here. It's really easy to use. What I like to do is kind of line the piece like a cookie and then flood the inside. And I do want to make sure to give this lots and lots of time to dry because I'm doing this on plastic and it can only dry from the top and it can't dry from both the top as well as if I was to do it on paper. It's going to take a while for that to dry. You also want to be careful because you don't want these to dry overlapping each other. So when you move them, if you have to move them, because in a perfect world I would have done them so I didn't move them, you want to be very, very careful that they don't touch each other. While it's still wet, it will easily correct itself, but after it has dried, you can't fix it. Now, I wanted to dry it or to do it on that media mat because if I happen to have gotten any glossy accents underneath there, it's going to peel off really, really easily, and I won't have to worry about it sticking to any paper. So while that is set aside to dry, I have 3 different ink pads here that I'm going to use to color in my wood boards. I have a ton of them colored, more than I need, but I always like doing extras. Any extras I can put in a Ziploc bag, save with this die set, and use for another project. The 3 colors that I'm using is pumice stone because it's a nice gray beige and it's going to work well with this cardstock. And then I'm using a touch of scorched timber. It's a really, really dark brown. I'm not being heavy with it, but I do want some areas that are a little bit darker than just the pumice stone. And then I'm also using weathered wood. I absolutely love barnwood walls that have a bit of a gray tone to them and that also have pops of a little bit of a blue tone to it. So I'm getting that with this. I'm not doing a ton of the wood with that weathered wood, but I do want enough on that background so that I can see that there are some boards that have a blue tone to them. And the weathered wood is perfect for this because it's a blue that has a bit of a gray tone to it. So it's going to coordinate beautifully with this. I'm using random bits of each one of the colors. I'm doing mostly that pumice stone around a lot of the pieces, but I am doing a few pieces with a little bit of that scorched timber to get that darker color, and then some different pieces with that weathered wood. Now, there were 3 different sizes of these boards here. There's 2 that are thinner but have 2 different widths to them, and then there's 1 that's thicker. And I'm using all 3 of these pieces. I want to make sure that I have lots of pieces to choose from. And I'm also doing some lines, stripes, some rows, that's a better word, with the thinner, and then some with the thicker. I'm doing most of them the thicker, but I like the look of it when it has a few different widths to the different rows. So I'm going to start at the bottom. I just have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch cardstock here. I'm starting at the bottom and I'm going to work my way up. The main thing I want to keep in mind is I don't want the joins between the different boards to line up between different rows, so I want them all different. And I'm using my Barely Art liquid glue because if I need to lift it up, I can. If I need to shimmy it, I can. I have a lot of freedom with this. I'm going to do a few rows here, and then I'm taking my scissors and I'm trimming them off, and I can reuse those end pieces. And any of the ends that I trim off and don't reuse, I can keep those again for a future project. I know they won't go to waste. Already after doing that, I love that pop of blue in that one row there. So I'm so pleased with how that is looking. It's a great idea to regularly cut those ends off just to make sure that you can reuse them right away and get some of those used up as quick as possible. I love that these boards have a wood grain that gets pressed into it when you're cutting them out. So when you go and ink blend that, you see that a little bit more, and it ends up looking a little bit more like wood. With different ink pads as well as different cardstock colors, really the sky's the limit when it comes to your color choices that for creating this. Like I'm doing one here that's more of a gray beige color tone with some pops of blue. You could also do one that had pops of like a little rusty red color or whatever. There's so many different color choices that you can do, so you can really customize it to the look that you're wanting. I wanted something that was light enough so that it wasn't going to compete when I put the vials and the plants on top. And I also wanted to create a background that was interesting, but something that showed you a different way that you could use this die set other than just creating those propagation frames to go with the greenery as well as the laboratory glassware. Now I chose to use this on a piece of cardstock that was 4 1/4 by 5.5 and then glue it onto the front of my card base. You could, if you wanted, glue this directly onto your card base, and that way you could save yourself a step. I chose to do it this way. There's no right or wrong, it's just personal preference. So as you can see, I eliminated putting the glue on the back of the piece and just started putting the glue directly onto my cardstock here. That way I could just put a row that was big enough. I didn't have to worry about any glue going beyond the outside of my cardstock base. It's really whatever you prefer. And you can see that I regularly go and trim those pieces off. And then when I go to work on the next part, I try to use some of those pieces up first before picking from my pieces that were unused. And I do randomly grab one of the blue pieces as well as one of the ones that has the scorched timber on it, just to get some variation in that wall. It looks a little bit more interesting when you have some variation. And when I was doing my ink blending, I was trying to make sure not to make it completely perfectly ink blended. I tried to make sure that there were some areas that were heavier, some areas that were a little bit lighter with the ink, so that you can really see a little bit more of an interesting background with some variety to it. Once I have this whole piece covered, I can take my scissors, cut off the excess from the side, and there's a slight edge on the top that is overlapping as well, so I can cut that off as well. You could use a trimmer for this if you wanted to, but it's really easy to grab a pair of scissors and just go along the edge of that cardstock. You know exactly where the edge is, and you don't have to worry about not being super precise with that. So there is my background. I absolutely love how that turned out. And like I said before, the variety that you can get with it, with different inks or different card bases, I think would make it'd be fun to play around and just create all sorts of different barnboard backgrounds. So while that is drying, I'm just going to take my propagated plants die cuts and I'm going to create or play around with how I want them on the front. And I want to do 3 of them. I have a lot of these die cut already that I did out of cardstock scraps, so it's a great way to use up those pieces. And when I'm doing a die cut session like this, I like to cut a ton of different pieces so that I have lots of variety to work with. I can use different shades of something within the same design, or I can ink blend. I just have a lot of choice. Any of these pieces that are extra, I just put in a Ziploc bag, keep them with that die set, because if I'm ever using that die set again, it'll be nice to have some pieces that are already cut, ready to go. There's also a couple roots that are in this die set. Now pay attention to which ones you're going to use, because that one that branches out isn't going to work in the little beaker glassware. And for this particular card, I want to have 3 different plants, and I think I need to use that beaker because I'm not going to, those beaker ones, because I'm not going to be able to fit 3 with that round bulb at the bottom in that same card. So I'm going to use those with my last card so that they don't go to waste. So when it comes to choosing the root piece for this, it needs to be the narrower, longer one. And once again, this may not be accurate to what these plants actually are. That's totally fine. I'm cool with that. So before I glue anything together, I'm taking a bundled sage distress ink pad and I'm adding a little bit of shading to the greenery. I'm doing that at the base of the plants, and it's a great way just to give it a little bit of dimension with very little effort. You don't need to have a lot of ink, and even with different shades of green cardstock, I can use that same ink pad for the same thing. So this one that I'm working on here has tiny little leaf pieces that get die cut that you can add to the top of them to add some different color variation. I'm not putting it on every single one. I'm just putting a dot of the liquid glue, and then I'm using a jewel picker to pick it up and put that little die cut down. They are so tiny that you need something to be able to pick it up, and this jewel picker is perfect for that. You could do this jewel picker for some of the larger leaves as well, but I find for those, I tend to like to use a pair of tweezers to hold them, put glue on the back, and then assemble them. So I can put that dot of glue on several different leaves and then place a few different leaves with that jewel picker. These leaves have a little bit of a teardrop shape to them, so I'm just making sure that that teardrop, or that pointed part of that teardrop, is facing towards the stem. I'm using 2 different die cuts of this so that I have a little bit of dimension and the plant looks a lot fuller. I'm putting the darker one towards the back. For the die cut that I'm using at the top of my card, I also have 2 different ones here, and once again I'm using the darker one in the back. It's just going to give it a little bit more fullness, and it's going to add a little bit more dimension by having a couple different colors of green here. If you don't want to have that much fullness though, you could easily just do 1, and I think you would have a great result at the end as well. I had all these pieces die cut, so I just figured I might as well use them for this card and get a nice full look. It's personal preference, whatever you prefer. So once I have this done, I can set that to the side and let that completely dry. And these little pieces, easy enough to pick up with your fingers. And I have all my pieces laid out on the top of my acrylic block that I have holding down my background on my card. I like to be able to see all of these die cuts right against the background, and then when I lift it up and move it to the side, I don't lose my design in any way. I told you at the beginning that I love when leaves have the pink pop in the center, so I'm using some picked raspberry to put them in the center of these leaves. A lot of these greens from the propagated plants die set have a base layer as well as a leaf overlayer, so you can do them in a couple different shades of green, and you can also ink blend them to get some extra detail, to add a pop of color. However you want, you can get really creative with them. And I love the options for that and being able to get creative in that way. So for these, I like to just hold them with a reverse pair of tweezers. These are tweezers that when they're closed, I'm not squeezing them. In order to open them, I squeeze them. So they're reverse tweezers, and I find them really handy for things like this. If I happen to fumble my fingers, like I said, I'm a little bit of a klutz, I don't have to worry about dropping it. That die cut will stay in my tweezers. So once that is dry, I can put that to the side. I have my glassware here. I put a blob of the glossy accents on the side of the mat so I can touch that to see if it is completely dry. That way I don't have to worry about possibly touching my piece that I want to use on my card, it not being dry and ruining it. So by having a little blob on the side, and if I'm using them on cardstock, I'll put it on a little scrap of cardstock. I can make sure that I can easily test to see if something is dry without ruining it. And I usually will pick a piece of, or I'll do a dot that's similar to the size that I used on the card. Or in this case, I just did a larger blob because some of these areas were quite big, especially on the glassware that had the big bulb at the bottom. I wanted to give a similar size so that I could really tell if it was totally dry. Now I'm going to use the glossy accents for gluing this in place because it dries completely clear. You could use the Barely Art glue, that does dry clear, but I wanted to demonstrate that you could actually use the glossy accents to glue things as well. And I thought by adding that to the back there, it was also going to add a little bit more dimension with the water look with the beakers. So I'm going to glue the plants and the roots to my beakers first, and then I'm going to glue them to the front of the card. Now, if you have the patience and the time, it'd be a great idea to glue all these pieces together first and then assemble them to the card when they're completely dry. I just waited a few minutes till the glue or the glossy accents had a few minutes to just get a little bit tacky. But if you're worried about things falling apart, and they did start to shift and move while I was still creating them, you could wait till they're completely dry, and then you don't have to worry about them as much when you're moving them to your card. I put my glossy accents all over the top or the bottom part of the plant that touches the root, and then all over the root, and then put that on the back of the glassware. And I'm doing this for all of them. In the Propagation frames die set, there are little brackets. I die cut them out of a dark silver cardstock, and I'm just gluing them to the top of these little beakers so that when I glue them to the base of my card, it looks like those brackets are what is holding them on the barnwood wall. Now you could do this afterwards if you wanted. While I had all these pieces out, I figured I might as well glue that all down at once. So my glue isn't totally set, but it's set enough that I can start moving things around here. So I'm placing them on my back here. I want to make sure that these beakers are at different levels and different widths apart. You can space them however you like and whichever way looks good to you. You could even put them all in a row. Because that plant at the top is a lot fuller, I wanted it towards the top, and I didn't want it to be blocking or covering a different one. So I wanted to give each one of those plants a little bit of room, and I also wanted to give it a little bit more interest. And by having them differently spaced as well as at different levels, I thought it would be a little bit more interesting to look at. Once these are glued down, I can let them sit for a few minutes, and I'm going to use one of the sentiments from the Coordinating Sentiment set to add to the bottom of this card. So I have my same gray beige cardstock, and I tried just using the Scorched Timber Distress ink and stamping the sentiment and then die cutting it in and doing a little bit of ink blending around it, but you kind of lost the sentiment. So instead I took a Versamark ink pad stamped that sentiment, and then I'm using the Scorched Timber Distress Glaze. So I still get that same color, but it's going to add a little bit of dimension as well as a little bit of shine. And then when I go to do some ink blending around the sentiment once it's die cut, I'm not going to lose that sentiment. So I embossed that and then lined up my die cut it out, and then I can use those same colors that I ink blended my background with to coordinate that sentiment with that background. Now, I did also try off screen using one of those boards from that background to stamp my sentiment on, because I thought that would be kind of cool as well. But because that die has the wood grain pieces in it, that get pressed in there, it wasn't a completely flat surface, so I didn't get a full nicely stamped sentiment. Wherever those indents were, it skipped it, so it didn't look quite right doing it that way. Just wanted to mention that in case you thought that would look cool. I'm sure it absolutely would, and it might work if you stamped it and then say did the die cutting of the wood. That may work, but to do it on a pre-done die cut, it didn't work. I'm using a piece of foam tape just to add a little bit of dimension to that sentiment. This is a card that has a lot of texture and dimension to it anyways, and I didn't want that sentiment to get lost on there. So there is the completed card. I absolutely love how that looks, and I love that barnwood background. So for my third card here, I'm going to do one of the propagation frames. I'm doing a blue background with this. It's going to coordinate with the blue on the little laboratory glassware that I'm going to put my plants in. And it's also going to give it a nice background for my plants as well as the propagation stand to stand off of or to look nice against. So I have my propagation frames already die cut. For this one, I'm using a little bit different color ink. So I'm using some walnut stain. And I'm going to lightly ink blend around the outside edges of that propagation stand. There are some smaller die cuts to go on the inside to give it a little bit of a shadow. So I'm going to be a little bit heavier with the ink on those pieces so that when I do assemble this together and add it to that propagation stand, it's going to stand out a little bit more. You're going to be able to see it a little bit more. It's going to give it a little bit more contrast. So these pieces for the propagation frame are die cut from that same gray beige cardstock that I used in the second card. You could do this out of whatever color cardstock you want. It doesn't necessarily need to be something this color. And because woods come in so many different shades, you can get really creative and fun with that. I chose to do a different colored ink just to give it a little bit of a different look. And you don't necessarily even need to ink blend this. I like doing ink blending because it gives it a little bit of shading and makes it look a little bit rustic, which is the look that I was going for here. But you could just die cut these pieces and then assemble them with just the die cuts. And then for the pieces that are a little bit more of a shadow piece or the darker pieces, you could just die cut them out of a darker shade. I'm using my same Barely Art glue in the fine tip bottle to glue these pieces together. It's really handy to be able to have a glue bottle with a really fine tip on it that you can just be very precise with your ink or with your glue and then place your piece. Now the top of this propagation frame has a slight little slit in there that you can put this metal rod through. And I did find that it was hard to put that piece through as is, but I took my die pick and just poked that through first, and it made it a lot easier to get the piece through. This is die cut out of a dark silver cardstock, and then once I had that piece through, I did put a dot of glue so that that would stay in place and I didn't have to worry about it shifting in any way. I'm taking that walnut stain ink pad and I'm just going to ink blend around the outside of my embossed background. This is that Leafy Helix embossing folder again, and you could do more ink blending or create a pattern background, but I didn't want anything to compete with this stuff on the front. So I'm just choosing to just ink blend around the edges and frame it a little bit. It's going to coordinate with that frame because it's the same ink color, but it's not going to be such a busy pattern on the background that it's going to compete with the plants that I'm going to have on the front. Once that is ink blended, I cleaned off my surface, put some liquid glue on the back, and then put that to my card base so that that can sit and dry for a moment. I have my frame completely done and dried, and now I can start assembling and laying out how I want my beakers and my propagated plants to look. So I'm only able to fit 2 of those beakers with the bulbs at the bottom. If I use the same ones as the last card, you'd probably easily be able to get 3 on here. But that's okay because the plants that I'm going to use are a little bit fuller as well. So I think more than 2 would be too much for a card with this layout anyways. I chose different plants to use than the ones that I used for the last card. So these ones here, I'm going to do that same ink blending on them just to give them a little bit of dimension. I have die cuts here to go on the front, and I chose different colors of green so that I get some contrast between the stems of those pieces as well as the leaves. I'm going to glue these to the leaves first, or to the bases first, and then I'm going to take my ink blending brush and my distress ink, and I'm just going to do a little bit of light blending on the back parts of those leaves just to give them a little bit of contrast. This particular one here is one that the leaf goes behind another one, so I did do that ink blending ahead of time just to make sure that it looked like it had a bit of a shadow from going behind that other leaf. You can easily ink blend these before putting them down if you want, like I'm doing here, or you could do it after, whichever is most convenient or whichever way you feel like doing it. I'm just using a regular ink blending brush. You could use a detail one if you wanted to be a little bit more precise. This is the type of ink blending that I don't think you have to be super precise with. It's just nice to have a little bit of color variation between the different areas of the leaf. It just gives it some visual dimension. So for the roots here, I chose which ones I wanted, and here I'm going to use the ones that spread out a little bit more. I did do a little bit of ink blending on the top of those roots just to give them a color variation. It's with that same walnut stain brown that I'm using for this whole card. I glued the leaves to the top of my little glassware there, and now I'm going to glue the roots to the bottom. So the last one I used my glossy accents for gluing. This one I chose to use the Barely Art glue for gluing just to show you that it does dry completely clear. So you can use a white glue that dries completely clear for this on the backs of these. It absolutely works the same way. I just wanted to give you some options, a little bit of variety here. So with that first one done and drying, I'm just going to start assembling the second one here. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I don't know what plants these are, so I don't know what colors they're supposed to be. So if they're not the proper colors, that's okay. I just had fun creating them. So I'm using those same reverse tweezers to hold those die cuts while I add a little bit of glue to those pieces. I love that they give so many varieties of different plants as well as the different overlays here. It makes it so that you can really pick and choose which ones that you want and get the look that you're wanting to go for. So you can choose if you want to glue the root to the base of the plant first and then glue your glassware over top of that. That works as well. Or you can glue the plant in and then the root right onto the glassware, whichever works. I did find with the last card, there was one that I hadn't put the root up far enough, so I had to adjust it a little bit. So you do want to make sure when you're doing this that you pay attention to how far up the root should be, as well as how far down the plant should be. So with all of those pieces ready to go, I'm going to glue down the frame to the bottom of the card here. I'm just making sure that it's centered in the card as well as even over the bottom part, and then I can arrange my plants. And as soon as I know exactly where I want them to go, I grabbed my glossy accents and I'm going to use that over the whole back. It's going to give it a lot more dimension and give it some good contact with the background of the card, especially since it's embossed. I want to make sure that that has some good contact, and because it's nice and clear, it's going to also appear like it's more of the water that's in there. So for these glassware, I do have the part that has the glossy accents over top of the alcohol ink on the front, so you can see the dimension from it, as well as where the water ends at the top, where the end of that alcohol ink is. I absolutely love how it looks and how it gives that some extra dimension. And because the alcohol, or because the glossy accents has a bit of a curved edge to it on the edge of those die cuts, it also gives it a little bit more of a rounded look, which I absolutely love. So these, I'm going to also put the little brackets or whatnot. These are the same ones that I used with the second card with the little beakers. I'm using the same ones on the top of here for brackets to hold it on this propagation stand. I'm using my Barely Art glue for this, and I'm just holding it in place for a couple seconds just to make sure that that has a little bit of time to set before putting it off to the side. I picked another sentiment and I just stamped it with that walnut stain ink pad, put my die on top of it, die cut off screen, and then I'm using that same walnut ink just to lightly ink blend around the edges. This will help it not to be quite so stark on the background. It'll tie it into that propagation stand as well as the ink blending around the outside of the card. I absolutely love this whole line and all the versatility and the different ways that it can be used. It's there's so much different choice with all the different plants as well as the different glassware you can choose. I really love the variety in here. The last step for this card is just put a dot of glue behind each one of those leaves. I want to make sure that they don't catch on anything when I'm putting this into an envelope, and want to make sure that that has some good contact. So once I have the dot of glue behind there, I put an acrylic block on there to set it aside to dry. And here is the completed card. I love the texture on the background that you get with that embossing folder, as well as all the texture you get with the different die cuts layered on top of each other, with the glassware, with the glossy accents. There's so much that you can do with this collection. I absolutely love it. These Better Press plates, I can't wait to play with them again and see them foiled because I think they would be absolutely stunning. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Have a fantastic day.